Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, October 15th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about an announcement this morning that Congressman Seth Moulton will announce a primary challenge bid against Senator Ed Markey in the state of Massachusetts. Ed Markey, who has represented Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. for a very long time, is running for re-election in the 2026 midterm elections at 80 years old. Seth Moulton is now trying to make this race a case of age and a generational fight of a younger generation of the Democratic Party running against the old guard, quite literally the old guard, with Ed Markey, who's been in the United States Senate for quite a long time now. Seth Moulton, who is making this case to many in the public who, after the last election, felt as if the Democratic Party had a problem with age, that too many of its congresspeople and senators have found themselves aging out in Congress to a point where they're leaving the seat at 90 or 92 years old, and in some cases are running for office on a lower age and running for re-election, at a time at which they are reaching well beyond retirement age. And so Seth Moulton, whether you like him or not, you like Ed Markey or not, is going to put up a very strong fight in this race. This is going to be the primary of all safe races to watch. It will be a very interesting one, and Ed Markey, who already announced he's running for re-election, has been holding fundraisers since the beginning of the year, has been in this to win this, knowing that in anticipation there might be a primary challenger. There's now this conversation being had here in Massachusetts as to whether or not Ed Markey should choose to step by and allow another Democrat to run against Seth Moulton in a head-to-head Democratic primary. Now, Seth Moulton going for this race really doesn't strike me as a surprising decision. Ed Markey has already faced his fair share of primary challengers and did so in the election preceding this one. In 2020, when Ed Markey ran for Senate, he faced against Representative Joe Kennedy, who was 39 years old, who was, again, not positioning this as much as a generational conversation or a generational campaign, but rather just one of representation across the state. And Joe Kennedy actually got 45% of the vote. It was not a great showing in terms of, the Kennedy family dynasty in Massachusetts, but it did show, at least to some degree, that there was a nature of competitiveness to this race that might foretell an eventual primary challenger years later. And while 6-year terms are, in fact, 6-year terms, it's a long time to be serving in the United States Senate, it was a question of who would primary Ed Markey as someone who has been a champion for progressive causes in Washington, D.C., has a history of being, this progressive who harnessed a lot of that energy, especially amongst young voters in 2020 in the Massachusetts Democratic primary against Joe Kennedy. The question really remains now, and is yet to be seen, is this something that he can harness again in 2026? As age comes into center stage, and as Seth Moulton in his announcement bid, and oftentimes, when these younger Democrats are running against older Democrats, sure, maybe some of the more, outsiders type of candidates that you see for Congress will mention age, but often there's that level of respect. Even when it comes down to Graham Plattner running against Janet Mills, and I get it's early, the primary announcement had only taken place yesterday, but the response from Plattner's campaign hasn't been just, Janet Mills is older than I am and would be the oldest elected freshman United States Senator, though younger than Ed Markey. It is a combination of things about it being, the same tried and tested and failed policies that, ran against Susan Collins before, whatever it is, that's the talking points of the Plattner campaign. But Seth Moulton directly in his announcement video, in a way that many other Democrats just simply have not, save, the congressional election in New York people have been paying attention to. The point is here that he says in the video announcement, I just don't believe Senator Markey should be running for another 6-year term at 80 years old. Even more, not me, but, Seth Moulton. Seth Moulton does not think someone who's been in Congress for half a century is the right person to meet this moment and win the future. Wow. Pretty intense fighting words for people that have been colleagues for quite some time. And Seth Moulton, who has absolutely had his own fair share of going for higher office, but also it very much seemed like he intended to run for Senate for quite some time now. When we think about it, Ed Markey, the Seth Moulton race, this election probably could have been predicted, but I think there was also, potentially some time at which Jake Auchincloss was considering running for this seat, that maybe Ayanna Pressley, if Ed Markey had stepped by and said, I'm not going to run for re-election, that she might be in this race today. These are all things that, are certainly worth speculating. But as it stands right now, the primary is pretty clear-cut. It's going to be Seth Moulton, and it's going to be Ed Markey, and it's going to be a very fascinating race. Now, I remember that 2020 race like it was yesterday. We covered it with Joe Kennedy because I remember that it was interesting because Joe Kennedy actually stood out as the favorite in the preliminary data. Now, Ed Markey was never really the underdog, if we're being honest. When it comes down to, who was endorsing Joe Kennedy III in this primary, there were a lot of U.S. representatives. There were a lot of people in Massachusetts who did it as well. There were some very big names that you would recognize today. Nancy Pelosi, Beto O'Rourke, Adam Schiff, Alyssa Slotkin, right? Very big names, Connor Lamb, people who came from neighboring states, people who came from Massachusetts, Hakeem Jeffries, shout out Steny Hoyer, my representative, right? Whether you agree with the decision or not, again, I'm just saying that because he's my rep, but the point is, it was a very contentious primary with a lot of people endorsing. But then on Ed Markey's side, who endorsed him, right? Elizabeth Warren, Chuck Schumer, going toe-to-toe with Pelosi, right? Joe Manchin, crazy to think about, right? A number of state representatives, another state officials, a lot of people in this race came out and endorsed Ed Markey in this race by the end of the campaign when Joe Kennedy initially led in the preliminary data. By the end of the campaign, it seemed to be pretty clear that Ed Markey was going to win the nomination. But that absolutely was going to be a very interesting race. But by the time you reached the general, no consideration there that this was going to be a competitive race at all. It was certainly not. Joe Kennedy III came out in full support of Ed Markey, and from then on, it ended the race. That was pretty much it. This race was always going to go to the Democratic Party. But in 2026, I'm less convinced that Markey has it in him to take this race and win it to the degree that he did in 2020. Granted, you were up against a Kennedy and a lot of money in that race, but what's to say Seth Moulton couldn't raise a lot of money too, and the appetite for, pushing out older generation Democrats is certainly quite high right now. I think across the board here, since Biden, you have found that has been the next thing that Democrats are looking to say, it isn't just that Democrats want new leadership to meet the moment. They feel as if that based off where our country is headed, it is simply not older members of Congress who can meet this moment. And that's what Seth Moulton is trying to tap into. And while I do think that, Seth Moulton, I think ideologically, is perceived of as more center, as someone who's more, moderate than Ed Markey in a similar way that Joe Kennedy, who, arguably had the same voting record as Ed Markey. I think a lot of people's criticism of that race is that it was not the right time for Joe Kennedy to enter the race. Maybe if he had ran this time, the reception would be different under the present day circumstances. But again, what is done is done. When it comes down to 2026, Seth Moulton might be capturing in that more moderate perspective while simultaneously being able to double down on an issue that really is not winnable. Right, when it comes down to the issue of age, Ed Markey is going to have to make the case for experience and time in D.C. as a means of benefiting Massachusetts. Because there is a benefit of being in the Senate for decades on end. It's that when your party's in power, you have agency over committees. You have seniority. That's the way that Washington, D.C. and many other workplaces, very obviously, that's the way the world goes round. But as it pertains to Massachusetts, as it pertains to this Senate race, I think it will be very interesting because I do not think Ed Markey believes in his core that he can win this case on age. I do not believe that many Democrats across the state either believe it is a winning case at all for Ed Markey. Does that mean he can't win the primary? No, he certainly can. But it means they would have to pivot. They would have to focus on turning this into an experience thing, and that maybe committing that this would be the final term in office, maybe committing that, this is just going to be the one last hurrah for Ed Markey's campaign, and he's going to do all the good that he can in office in the final 6 years. Who knows? Because that's the way that I think is going to be approached by this. Because without a substantive primary, this race would have been an easy cakewalk for Ed Markey. But now it will not be. There is this urge, this appetite that exists within the party base, and it exists here even in Massachusetts. Even as a state that chose Ed Markey before, you will find there are people that went for Markey in 2020 that will not in 2026, that are looking for something new. And to be fair, coming off the last cycle, the American public has the right to want something new when it comes down to age in politics. And whether you believe Ed Markey or Seth Moulton are right to be in this nomination process, what we know is that voters do not want older candidates. That has become so mainstream and such a prevailing issue that it is launching someone's congressional campaign. Senate campaign. Think about that for a moment, right? That's how impactful this is to a lot of the voters. So my only hesitation on this race and understanding, what is happening is we don't have any data, right? When you look at the polling data in this race, it's all hypothetical. And even then, it was against two candidates that would never run against each other. We have one poll showing that Seth Moulton is trouncing Ed Markey. I don't know how much I believe that when 36% of respondents are undecided. And I remember those early data points were saying that Joe Kennedy would win. So we have to wait and see. We have to get to a point of understanding, okay, how is Moulton doing? How is Ed Markey doing? And only time will tell. But this is facing off to be potentially one of the most interesting Democratic primaries in a safe state, because there are no electoral implications in the general election about who the Democrats nominate. No matter who it is on the ballot, they will win the Senate term, and so it might be Ed Markey or it might be Seth Moulton. And there's that third-pronged approach, that if Ed Markey suddenly decides that he's not going to run, that maybe other candidates do. Maybe Ayanna Pressley gets in this race. Maybe others do. And we will see. But the Senate election today stands to be potentially one of the first real fights between the old guard and the aspiring new guard of the Democratic Party, with a congressman who is, 40-something years old running in this race against Ed Markey, who's been in Congress for, as Seth Moulton put it, half a century, for a very long time, and would be 81 years on Election Day. Thinking about that, this is going to be a very fascinating race to watch, a very important one, I think, just for understanding the future of Democratic politics. And Seth Moulton, who made this announcement today, is likely going to be center focus and center stage for Massachusetts politics for the next coming months as we get into the primary season against an incumbent United States Senator. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already. Check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.